back to In with Denoux.
How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to In with Denoux featuring Jordan Shannon. We have some exciting announcements for you guys. We're going to have a series coming up starting in about 3 weeks or so, and it's going to be the mighty men and women of God. And before that, what we're going to do today and next week, we're going to be talking through my favorite story in the Bible. And then next week, we're going to be talking through Jordan's favorite story in the Bible. We just thought it would be a cool way just to help you guys get to know us, our favorite stories, and just start thinking about your favorite stories. And maybe you can share them with us. And one day, maybe we'll walk through some more stories in the Bible of yours, which would be really cool. And then we'll jump into mighty men and women of God. If you're following us on our socials, we're going to be posting about, who is some people that inspire you from the Bible so that we can talk through those. We're going to make a list of our own, but we'd love to get your thoughts and ideas as well. So if you're following us on IG or TikTok or Instagram, IG or TikTok, then let us know in the DMs. And if you're not following us on our socials, go ahead and do that. We have an IG, we have a TikTok, and then follow us on YouTube, subscribe there as well. We definitely want to get your guys' comments, your thoughts. We'd love to talk through some of the figures in the Bible that you look up to, that you relate to, or just ones you'd like to learn more about. So we're going to be starting that series in a few weeks. But today we're going to be jumping into my favorite story in the Bible, which comes from 1 Samuel 14. And I'm just going to walk through it a little bit, and then I'll get Jordan's thoughts as we go, and we'll kind of talk back and forth a little bit about some of the, lessons that can be learned from this. I'm not going to read it all the way through, but I'll read some excerpts and then just kind of explain as well. And so I think a big part of this story has to be explained from the chapter before. The ending of the chapter before kind of helps explain the setting of this. So basically, this is what's called Jonathan and his armor bearer, or some versions of the Bible, the title says Jonathan attacks the Philistines. So what's important to know is just before chapter 14, it walks through how the Israelites, they have no weapons in their camp. Like basically the Philistines make sure that there's no like smiths, so no weapons can really be made. So Jonathan and his father Saul, so Jonathan's father is King Saul, and they are the only two in the entire army that have swords. So everyone else has like farming tools. They've like sharpened up farming tools. So they don't even really have the proper weapons for battle. They're severely outnumbered. And so that's important to know as we go into this story. So basically, at the beginning of chapter 14, it talks about how the Israelites are basically just hiding out from the Philistines. They're not trying to like formulate a plan. They're not trying to attack. They are really just cowering. And a lot of people would say rightfully so. They're outnumbered. They don't have weapons. So why would they attack, right? But it talks about how during this time, Jonathan says to his armor bearer, and I'm going to read this part in chapter 1. It says, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side of this cliff," basically. And he says, but he did not tell his father. So he didn't tell the king that he was going to attack the Philistines. And it talks about how the army is set up. And this part I always read, like when I read this so I read this in college, and it became my favorite story, and I started doing Bible talks on it. And there's something that I always think through of like, why is this said? Like there's certain things in the scriptures where it's like, why is this detail mentioned, right? These little tiny details. And one of them is in verse 2, where it says, Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeath under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men. And then it talks about one of them was wearing an ephod. So in my mind, I was like, why is it showing that they're sitting under this tree, like this pomegranate tree? And why does it specify that one of these men is wearing an ephod? And what even is an ephod? So Jordan, I don't know about you, but I always wonder, I'm like, what are these little details? Why are they there?
Yeah.
Is that something that you've experienced?
Yeah, like what's the significance of an ephod, or
Yeah.
what's the
Yeah.
significance of these specific jewels on an ephod, right? Like, but what's the historical context, and why is it significant to this particular narrative and this
Mhm.
story? That stuff crosses my mind when I'm in the scriptures, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. So that's kind of like when I was first reading this as a young man, I was like, man, I need to figure out. It was kind of like curiosity, and that's what's cool about the scriptures is that I think that you have to have a curious mind when you're reading, and that's something where I was like, man, okay, why the pomegranate tree? And to be honest, like I don't know what the significance of like the type of tree that it is or anything like that, but the ephod part of it. And I will say I do have a theory on the like of why the tree is mentioned. I really think it's just when you think about the shade of a tree, you know, you're thinking about like a picnic, chilling out. Like you don't think about battle or war, right? So I think it just shows that these men were just content to like hide out and just relax, right? Like that's the mindset that they're in right now. And I think that that's important to know the mindset is that it's so different than what we see from Jonathan and his armor bearer, right? Like they're just chilling, they're relaxing. I think for us, it would be like us sitting on the couch, like watching TV when, you know, there's a fire outside, you know, like there's something that needs to be done. There's danger near. And the significance of the ephod is that I learned that, you know, the person that would wear the ephod, it was basically like a breastplate. And it was worn because they were the one that you would go to inquire, like, is God telling me to go to battle or not? Kind of thing. So they're like who the king would go to, you know, or whatever to decide like, do we do this or do we not kind of thing. And it basically shows, and then it later in that passage, it says no one was aware that Jonathan had left. And I think that that's important too, because once I learned that that's what the person wearing the ephod, like that was their purpose, was to go and be like, do we go to battle or do we not? It showed in my opinion, it shows the faith that Jonathan had, right? Like you get this contrast early in the story where the army is sitting under this tree in the shade of the tree. They're chilling, they're relaxing. They're not trying to figure out what needs to be done to overcome their enemy, to overcome this predicament that they're in. But then also Jonathan is like, I don't need to go, and I know what God wants us to do. And I think this is important for us. And what I'm not saying is to like not get advice, to not ask people, you know, whatever. But sometimes there's things that you just know, like this is right. You know what I mean? Like if no one's going to do this, I'm going to do this. You know, I think that like, you know, if you're at church or whatever, and there's something that needs to get done to like make sure service goes well or whatever, like, okay, I need to volunteer to take care of communion, or I need to help move these chairs. Like, you don't need to ask like, hey, should I be moving these chairs? Like, if you know it needs to get done. And I know that's like a very, very watered down version of what's going on in this story. But Jonathan is like, man, we're sitting here doing nothing, and this enemy is threatening our lives, you know, and the lives of our family, like even our nation, right? And God himself, like they're opposing God himself. And so he's like, man, we need to do something about this. So then Jonathan lays out this plan to his armor bearer. And spoiler, for a battle strategy, it's horrible. It's terrible. And I've talked about this, like if you know me well, you've heard me talk about this. I've preached on this, but this story, I feel like something new can be learned every time, or a reminder of something that you already know. So Jonathan says to his young armor bearer, come, let's go to the outposts of the uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few, right? So Jonathan lays out this plan. He's like, hey, just the two of us, we're going to go and see what happens. And perhaps the Lord will save us, right? It's not even like the Lord will definitely save us. It's like, perhaps the Lord will save us. And so this is one of those things where it's like, I don't know if you've ever, especially like in a like college or high school or whatever, when someone's like, hey, I got an idea. Usually you're like, let me hear the idea, right? Like, especially with like young men, it's like we were thinking some crazy stuff when we were younger, right? So if I'm like, hey Jordan, I got an idea, the natural question would be, what's your idea, right? But before he even explains the idea, right? Like he just says, nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many, by few. That doesn't tell the plan. It's just like, let's go over there. And then the armor bearer replies in verse 7. He says, do all that you have in mind. His armor bearer says, go ahead. I'm with you, heart and soul. Before even like hearing the plan, right? Like, it's just crazy. He's like, I'm with you, heart and soul. Let's go to this army, just the two of us, and perhaps the Lord will save us, right? So then Jonathan lays out his plan, right? And I'd love to see the armor bearer like, dang, I already said I'm with you, heart and soul. Like, I can't back down, because the plan is terrible. It's terrible. So Jonathan says, come on then, we will cross over towards them and let them see us. All right. So it's like, all right, we don't even have like the element of surprise. Let them see us. If they say to us, wait there and we will come to you, we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. So just think about battle strategy, right? And for our fellow nerds, think about Star Wars, right? Episode 3, the famous like battle between Anakin and Obi-Wan, right? Where, he's looking down at Anakin and he's like, Anakin, it's over. I have the higher ground, right? Like, that's the situation here. Like, in that sense, the Philistines are Obi-Wan and the Israelites, like Jonathan and his armor bearer, are Anakin. Now, the evil part is switched. But in terms of their positioning, like, they're done. They're low. They're the low ground. Yet the sign is, if they say, come up to us, that means God has given us into their hands. So that means, like, if God has given us victory, it means we have to climb up to the enemy, right? So it would literally, like, think about how vulnerable you are if you're like climbing up a ladder, right? Like, anyone could come and push that ladder over, or if someone's up already on the roof, they could push the ladder over or like throw something down at you. That's the position that they're in. Yet that is the sign that the Lord has given them into their hands. And so oftentimes I'm like, man, why is the terrible strategy the one that shows like that God has given them into our hands? And I really do think that it's like to show that it's all God, right? Like, this plan would not
Yeah.
work unless God intervened, right? Like, this is the worst plan of all time. Does that make sense? What are you thinking,
Yeah.
Jordan? Sorry, I don't want to like talk the whole time. So what are you thinking?
I'm just imagining that Jonathan is like, we see those buddy movies where it's two best friends, and usually there's one that's like a leader that says, "Hey, let's get into some trouble or some shenanigans." A good comparison. Well, I'm gonna date myself a little bit, but Keenan and Kel. Keenan
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Kel is people. Like, Keenan usually has these crazy ideas for plans, and Kel just says, "I got you. I'm with you,"
yeah,
no
yeah,
matter how foolish it is. But in this case, right, like Jonathan being Kel and just like being loyal to, his armor bearer being Kel and him being super loyal to Jonathan, you would think like there would be some cowering, there's some fear, there's some hesitation, but there was a really strong conviction that, you know what, God's going to take care of us, even though like we're taking on an army and it's two of us. Maybe might be able to take, like, if I'm his armor bearer, I'm like, maybe I might be able to take 6 at most. Like, I might be able to take this many, right? Like, if I'm trained for this, but there has to be some elements of faith that says like, no, do you have confidence in me, the Lord your God, or are you putting your confidence in your own strength, right? Because if your
yeah,
confidence is only in your own strength, then yeah, Jonathan and his armor bearer are going to be done for. But I do think there's like some allegory or some tale for us, like, when we're taking on these battles, we're taking on these challenges or these stresses, like, right, like, are we going to God? Are we consulting God? And do we have someone who is willing to go to God with us? Because I think that was something as well. Like, Jonathan did go to God, but he also knew he needed people he could trust, and his armor bearer was there full, like, just ready for anything, even when the plan's not there or the plan is not clear.
yeah,
I think
yep,
oftentimes in our own insecurity, I'll speak for myself as someone who likes to have like a sense of like, whenever I'm giving a talk or teaching or anything, I always want to make sure I have a good plan. And I think that's a good idea in general, is to have something prepared or planned. But there has to be room for the spirit. There has to be room for the spirit to move and to walk and to help me not rely on my own strength. And I think this is what we see here with Jonathan and his armor bearer, is that like, hey, you you have strength, you have skills, but this battle is not going to be given to you because you have some great strategy or you
right,
have the strongest personnel. It's actually going to be given because you have submitted yourself to the Lord, and it's pretty radical, right? To think
yeah,
about,
yeah.
pretty impressive and pretty inspiring.
hmm Yeah, for sure. I love this part of the story because, and I'm sure there's a lot more depth to this story that I could look even deeper into. Like, I'm kind of thinking of this right now, because this is kind of like just the scratching the surface of this story. And I have looked into it deeply, but there's even some things I'm thinking right now that I'm like, I don't know what all, like, I have looked into what an armor bearer does, and obviously, like, they carry the weapon of of the soldier. They follow them on the battlefield. Like, basically, they're their right hand, they're their backup kind of thing. And it's deeper than that. But I also don't know what it would mean for the arm. I'm assuming like death of some sort, but I don't know for sure. But like of abandoning your post, right? So like, but I do think that this story shows though, like I think it shows the depth of who Jonathan is as a man of God, is that his armor bearer is so with him, I think because he knows he's a man of God and he trusts him completely. And again, like I said, I don't know, like he probably doesn't have a choice to not follow him, but I think that in the circumstances given, like those rules kind of go out the window, right? Like if it's like, no, I'm not gonna sacrifice myself for this stupid plan kind of thing. But he's with him heart and soul, as it says, without hesitation, without hearing the full plan. Like he's just there. And a point that I made when I preached this sermon was talking about, when someone and you love like throws out a plan, kind of what to your point, Jordan, of like having a plan. And it is a good idea to have a plan, right? Like we've even talked about that back on the episode talking about like lessons that we've learned when you talked about doing the all night prayer and kind of how you went on a whim instead of having a plan and how it kind of didn't go well. So there obviously is times to plan things out or whatever. But my point is that when someone has an idea that you think is a little out there, to not necessarily just shoot it down because you think it's out there, but to help someone refine it, especially if it's someone younger than you or someone that you're, leading in a way, to help them refine that idea so that it does work, so that they can build their faith instead of just being like, no, like that's not going to work. Like that's dumb. Because that's happened to me in my youth, where I've had a plan, I've had a thought, especially my years in Orlando. My goodness, like, me and a couple of brothers, we had so many plans that and thoughts and ideas that were just like shot down for reasons that didn't make much sense to me at the time and still now. And so I know how much damage that did to, my confidence, to my faith in some ways, but to have brothers and sisters as well that trusted me completely and had my back when I had like wild ideas or crazy ideas. And a story that I told when I preached this as well. Well, one, I even like a couple episodes ago when we had Gio on, Gio was talking about how him and I had some crazy ideas of how to like get people into Bible studies one summer. And even though we didn't execute them perfectly, I feel like because the heart behind it was to really help people, to really try to show people God, that God really did work through our ideas, even though they weren't necessarily refined or even good ideas sometimes. But him and I were just throwing out like crazy stuff, and someone became a Christian from that, as we talked about with a sister named Rochelle. And she's still doing great and still doing wonderful. And it came through us kind of failing at an idea we had, but we just did it and God used it. And, the story I told when I preached this was, me and I think three other guys. And this was Jordan before you and I met. And it was Kyle, Fix, Levi, myself, and I think David Burnt, and I honestly can't remember if John Norton was with us too, but I'm sure he was if the other two guys, New Hampshire guys, were there. And it was rush week, so it was the first week of school at UF, and so we were having like a frisbee night to like invite people out or whatever. And at the end of, we were actually on the track and field like in the middle. We had played frisbee, and the 4 or 5 of us were sitting there after everybody had left, and we were just kind of talking, and honestly don't even remember who threw the idea out. It kind of seems like something maybe David Burnt, like if I had to give credit, that's probably who I feel like would come up with this idea of the group of us. But whoever it was just like, hey, why don't we, because again, rush week is where there's just frat parties going on, right? Like it's people trying to get into frats, and there's these crazy parties, like wild parties going on in all the frat houses, and the frat row is right there, like by the track and field area. And so we could hear these parties
Yeah.
going on, and someone was like, yo, why don't we just go to all the and when they first said it, like when they first started down the sentence, they were like, why don't we go to all the frat parties? Like that's how they started the sentence, and like share our faith to the whole group. One of the Chacones might have been with us too, but I'm not even sure if they were or not.
That
Anyways,
sounds like a cool thing.
yeah, if it was, I think it was it wasn't Tyler though, but
Yeah.
I don't even know if one of the Chacones was there. It's not important, but basically we went to each frat house, bro, and we took turns. Each of us took turns. We went inside, bro, and I'm talking like wild college party, like music, like crazy people drinking, beer pong being played, like all sorts of crazy stuff going on. And we went inside, and bro, we just screamed at the top of our lungs. We were like, "Yo!" like, and got everyone like quiet, and then shared our faith, and then left. And people were like, "Who are these people?" You know? And we did that at like each frat house. And we took turns like quieting down everybody. It was terrifying. And nothing came of that, right? But like something that I shared in my sermon was that sometimes, you know, you do something and it's for the person you're saying the words to, right? Like if you're on campus and you're like looking for an open soul and you're having a one-on-one, like you're sharing your faith to try to help like save that person's soul, right? In that moment, if someone came out or like was genuinely interested and came to talk to us, that's like bonus. But I feel like that moment, in the moment, that's what we were hoping for, right? Was like, well, somebody will come to God from this, right? On retrospect, it's like, was anyone really going to come to God from that? Probably not. But I really do think that was a bonding moment for us to trust each other and like not only trust each other like as brothers, but also just individually to like face down something that's hard and that's scary and do it, you know? Like Tony Fernandez and Broward used to always say like, man, like men, like we need to do hard things, right? And that's like when we went to Yosemite and like hiked and did all the crazy trails at Yosemite, it was like we need to do hard things, like that was our thing or whatever. And I think that was that, because then after that, bro, like sharing my faith after that was easy. Like opening my mouth, you know, was easy. Like going into a frat house with hundreds of people and like stopping the party to like talk about Jesus. I'm like, okay, I could walk up to this table that's studying, like 3 people that's studying, and like ask them to take their headphone off. You know what I mean? Like that stuff was easy after that. And I think that's what that produced, you know? Like even though no one like was like, yeah, let me stop partying and like go to Jesus, right? Like probably not the best strategic plan, like this story, right? Like that was not a winning battle of trying to actually convert someone. But I think it helped us convert people later because we did it, you know? And so, yeah, that group, like, and I think that's kind of a point too, like that, like, I don't know, maybe this is kind of a dumb point, but the fact that I can't, like, I do remember some of the people, but like, I can't even remember who exactly it was, you know? But I feel like it was a bonding moment for us. And it was something where, you know, my courage after that took a big, you know, boost up. And it's not to say I like, of course, later on the road, like I had days and weeks and months and moments where I was afraid to share my faith. Like it wasn't like a cure all for, you know, for courage. But I do think I go back to that moment where I'm like, okay, I did that when I was 19, you know, or whatever. I can share my faith with the cash register at the grocery store or my barber. You know, I've been talking the last like 3 times I got my hair cut, this young kid, I've been talking to him and he wants to like go to church together and, you know, stuff like that, which has been super cool for me. And he's just a really cool kid. And he's just interested. I was just telling him about my life. You know, sometimes you have a barber and they just cut your hair or whatever, you know? He's like one of those, which at first I was like, oh, like to be honest, at first I was like, oh, he's a chatter. No, I just want to get my hair cut. And he's like asking me all these questions. Then I was kind of like, man,
just give him a face.
I was like, exactly. I was like, bro, please just cut my hair. But then I was kind of like, I feel like the spirit just kind of was like, all right. And this was right, you know, right after all the crazy stuff that's going on with me in my life a few months ago was the first time I went to him. And I was like, man, I'm being selfish, you know, like I have all this stuff going on, but I'm being so selfish, you know, with like, you know, it tells us that, you know, we don't hold our faith in, you know, it talks about in, is it Isaiah that talks about like, I cannot hold it in. Like my bones are on fire, you know? Yeah, the fire shut up in my bones. Exactly. Jeremiah. That's right. And so I wasn't feeling that in that moment, but I was like, I thought of that scripture and I was like, man, like that's how I need to be, is that like, I don't want to be the person that's like, man, I don't want this person to talk to me. Like I should be like, if this person's talk to me, I'm going to tell them, you know, about God. And that's what I decided to do. And so that's been kind of cool, super cool kid. But anyways, you know, that story I think like relates to this story. And I use that point a lot if I'm, you know, preaching on this, or I've done this Bible talk 1,000 times on this story, where it's like, man, you know, if you have a crazy idea, like do it, you know, if you know it's right, do it. You don't need to look for the ephod or look
Yeah.
for your leader. Like look for, and granted, there are times where you need to go to your leader, ask, whatever, get some help. But if there's something, sometimes you don't have, like in that moment, we decided to do something and it was like 10, 12 at night, whatever time it was. Like, I'm not going to call up Troy or whatever at the time, or Kyle or whatever. And like, or not Kyle at the time, more like Troy, and be like, hey, we have this idea. Should we do it? It's like, no, like God put this on our heart. Let's do it, And I do think like, as we get older, I feel like for whatever reason, we have less and less. Now, granted, we're not like out with our buddies at, 12 a.m. on a college campus when we're like 35. But, we should still have moments like that, even if it's not like, yeah, like even if it's not like crazy like that. But like I just said, like with your barber, with the cash register, like someone at the cash register, with your neighbor, someone at work, coworker, to talk to them and invite them out, or, ask them to study the Bible if they're interested. And so anyways, that story is just something that I always relate to this. And I thought about that. Now, that happened before this became my favorite story, but I thought back to that moment immediately when I came across this story, and I was like, man, this story is fire. Like, I was reading through 1st and 2nd Samuel in college, and I came across this story, and I immediately thought about, that moment with those guys or whatever. So anyways, any thoughts
Yeah.
about that?
It's so cool how like these types of stories are pocketed or packaged in a way that, you know, we know that the outcome from reading it is going to be something that's glorious for God.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's one thing to look at the story and be like, man, that's such a cool story. But then to put it into practice for our own lives, it can be very, very difficult, right? Like, because it is the sense of like doing something great for him, and we know from maybe there's a call of like, yeah, like tell the world about me. So tell the
Mm-hmm.
world about Jesus, right?
Yeah.
So that means I'm talking to friends, talking to your neighbors, right? Tell like right, like go tell of what he's done for you. And so if you're taking that call as a college student at a big university, right, at a frat row, right, the call is aligned with God's will of like telling
Mm.
everybody what he's done for you. But the venue or the avenue is probably like it's a long shot. It's a long shot to see anybody actually respond, right? Like in terms of like going to a frat room and talking about Jesus, because you'll get labeled different things, right? Get labeled like,
Yeah.
oh, there's that's Christian dude, or that Jesus
Yeah.
freak, or whatever it
Yeah.
might be, right? Do kids even say Jesus freak anymore? I don't think so. That's
I
such
don't
a
know.
80s and 90s, early 2000s. Oh,
Yeah.
but you know what I'm saying? Like, it's just like I remember we're at UF, Kyle Eastman was he said, I'm going to Turlington. I'm actually gonna do some preaching there. Just
Mm-hmm.
it's
Mm-hmm.
out in public. Whoever comes by, listen, but I'm just gonna preach and I'm just gonna talk about Jesus' love. That's it. Like I'm talking about grace and Jesus' love. That's all. And he said that, and I'm like, you know what, I'm gonna go too with them. And so it was myself and Josh Dampat that went.
Mm-hmm.
And Kyle first started speaking, and immediately, as soon as he opened his mouth, he said, "Good people of Turlington." At Turlington Plaza. He said, "Good
That
people of
sounds
Turlington."
sounds like
Right.
something Kyle would say.
And immediately as he said that, somebody on the bike just rode by and flipped him off. He
Yeah.
just kept going though. He's like, "Oh, that guy was waving. Oh, wait, no, he just flipped me off." Anyway, he just kept going. But I remember like being so inspired in that moment that I felt encouraged to just read from a scripture myself and share my story and essentially and preach with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't recall anybody deciding to want to, follow Jesus or make Jesus Lord of their lives from that experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what I do remember, like, is that I had a new, deeper respect and love for Josh and
Yeah.
Kyle for that
Yep.
experience. Like, just being able to share in that moment and that memory with them.
Mm-hmm.
And to just be able to do that myself, because I had that negative view of street preaching. I was like, oh gosh, like
Yeah.
fire and
Yeah.
brimstone. Is that what we're doing? Like, I'm not for that. But because I knew Kyle and I had a relationship, I'm like, I know he's not going to be doing that. You
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I was like, this should be interesting. This is faith building.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Mm-hmm.
honestly, that experience helped me feel more comfortable with, leading small groups. Help me reach out to people and talk about Jesus and talk about God and to even consider ministry for long term. I think that experience really helped propel my faith for a long time, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I still look back on that of like just, you know, street preaching can't, I don't know how many people actually seriously consider giving their lives to Jesus from just that experience.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
even out here we went to a Mariners game. You was there. You went to a Mariners game. There's always
Hmm.
a guy there street
Hmm.
preaching,
Hmm.
right? Like out here in Seattle, it's everywhere. It's one of the oldest ways of just trying to share scripture, right? But it's
Yeah.
also gotten terrible reputation because of how it's been
How it's done.
weaponized, right? Or how
Yeah.
it's been
Yeah.
used. So it's not a good generally speaking, it's not a good tactic for wanting to share about Jesus.
Yeah. For sure.
But what's really powerful is that, like if people really do feel like you are being genuine, that you're not judging them, that you are being gracious,
Hmm.
and more importantly, if you are being informed by God, then there's going to be some essence of relationship that can be built from that, and I
Yeah.
think that
Yep.
that is something that I can take from even just this story, right? Like this is a bad strategy, yet God was with them and they were able to see some really good success. That's how I felt with being in Turlington. Like this is not the best strategy, but we're gonna be
Hmm.
faithful and just say like, who's gonna hear us? Who's gonna listen to us? Who wants to, talk to us, right? Like, and this is something that we're young. We can just, it's the time to do something kind of like that too. But also
Yeah.
at the same time, maybe I'll share about this next week with my story.
Hmm.
Because as we're talking, I'm like, who am I inspired by? And I'm like, all right, I know the story now. So this is actually really, really neat.
That's what's
But
up.
yeah, like I just stories of like taking a strategy that in a human's eyes is terrible, but you
Hmm.
add God with it, and it's like you'll be one to know. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You'll
Yep.
you'll be able to get this victory, whether it be a spiritual or a personal or a physical victory. It's going to be something really. Your faith will be really moved by it.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. And it's so cool because I actually remember when you guys started that because, yeah, you, Kyle, and Josh, because I think if I'm not mistaken, that's when I lived with Josh, Dan Pat, at Rockwood.
I think so. Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
so I remember
Rockwood. Yeah.
him, yeah, I remember him coming home and like talking about it, and it became a thing. Like it became like a recurring thing, and different people went out
Mhm.
there. Because I remember Josh was like, "You should come out there," and I think me and Joseph went out there, and a number of people like went out. And I remember actually having the conversation where we were talking about like, "Hey, like this isn't even necessarily for like this is for us. Like this is for our courage to do it." You know, and it's like if someone comes
Mhm.
from it, like wants to learn about God, like awesome. But it's like this is for our courage, kind of thing. I remember having that conversation. And when you were saying that, I feel like this is like a positive moments right now. But I was thinking through this story and I was like, oh, this is Kyle too. But it was like a group thing, but it was a positive for Kyle that convicted me and a couple other people. So anyways, this was I think a couple years before I had met you. We had a like a retreat, but it was for like the Bible Talk leaders. But we just were in Gainesville, like we stayed in Gainesville, but it was like a little weekend retreat. So we did all the meetings and stuff at the Chris's, like that sunroom that they had or whatever, that back room that they
Yeah, yeah,
had.
yeah.
And so after the first night, we were walking. So they lived like right by University there in Gainesville,
Right across the
and
street from the stadium.
exactly, exactly. So after we had finished, we decided, hey, let's like walk up and down, like up University and just like sing and pray and stuff like that. So it's like a group of, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 of us. And so we're walking in on University and we're singing, hymns and spiritual songs. And this car kind of rolls by slowly and like throws a book and it hits Tyler Chacon in the head, this book or whatever. So like Tyler was in front of me. So I was standing next to Troy Chris and Tyler was in front of us and then Kyle was behind us. And or maybe Kyle was behind Tyler, then we were behind Kyle, I think. And so as soon as the because the car wasn't going super fast. So like as soon as they threw
Mm.
the book or whatever and it hit, like Troy and I like started running at the car. We were like mad, like upset. And then Kyle kind of like cuts in front and he grabs the book and he's like looks at Tyler, he has the book and he's like, bro, you're so lucky. And I was like, I was like, and Kyle, Kyle is super spiritual, bro. He was just like, he's like, yeah, like, you know, you know, as yeah, I'm probably dramatizing it a bit, but he said something to the effect of like, you know, that we're supposed to be persecuted, you know, like as
Yep.
people of God, like we're supposed to be persecuted. And me and Troy were just like, oh man, we were about to try to fight these people, you know, kind of
That's a
thing.
pure heart,
And
Kyle.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. But he
lucky.
was just like, you should keep this book kind of thing.
Be like, this is
But
a heirloom.
yeah, but I tell that story because I feel like it goes right into the next part of this story with Jonathan's armor bearer. So we left off with Jonathan telling his armor bearer this horrible plan, right? Of like, if they don't call out to us, then that, you know, it means God hasn't given them to our hands. But if they say to come up to us, then it means God has given us into our hands. So then in verse 11, it says, so both of them, meaning Jonathan and his armor bearer, showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. And then this is the response that the Philistines has, which made me think of this story about Kyle of like being persecuted, which I think is a cool little detail that I'm actually just realizing now that like later, I feel like, man, the Bible is just, it's a love story, but there's so many things that tie together in these little details that, you know, aren't necessarily like, this isn't necessarily tied directly to the passage about like being persecuted because of the name, but like it fits though, you know, like it fits. So these are men of God and they're talking to the enemy, right? And so this is the, you know, they walk over to the outpost and then they call out to them. And this is the response from the Philistine army. It said, look, said the Philistines, the Hebrews are crawling out of their holes they were hiding in. The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson. Right. So they're kind of mocking them, you know, like persecution because of who they are. It says, we'll teach you a lesson. So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. And Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet with his armor bearer right behind him. And I'll read the rest later. But man, it's just cool to see this kind of unfold, like we talked about before, where it's this horrible plan. But like I said, the reason that it is, you know, as we'll see in a moment, that it's successful is only because of God's power, right? Like we said, this is a horrible battle strategy. Like it's not a good plan, but yet it works. And it makes me think of another story actually with Justin Schoaf, who is one of my oldest friends and one of my best friends. And Jordan knows Justin as well. And so Justin is a year younger than me, 2 grades younger, like a little year and change younger. So I remember he moved up to Gainesville a couple years after I did, and we were living together. This is after Hanley and I had started the club on campus at Santa Fe, and we had just started tabling at the beginning of a semester. So basically, like, you know, we put this table up, we have information about our club, and we're basically sharing our faith. So we're like talking to people, seeing if they're interested to come to church, like talking to them, you know, whatever, inviting them to Bible talk. And so I remember we took turns like sitting, like someone sat at the table and there were other people out sending people over to the table to like sign, because we had like a sign up sheet and whatever. So it was kind of my shift to like sit at the table and like welcome people when they wanted to sign up and leave their info if they were interested in coming to church and stuff like that, or joining the club. So I was sitting at the table and Justin Schoaf was one of the people out there like sharing and whatnot. And he's like, he kind of like comes walking back to the table and he looks discouraged. And I was like, what's up, man? What's wrong? And he was like, yeah, I just, you know, was having a conversation with this guy. And he's like, I didn't know how to answer, you know, kind of thing. And it was kind of a funny moment, but it was also kind of a cool, like, teaching moment. And I mean, Justin and I are peers. Like, this was way back when, right? So when I say this, it's not like Justin, you know, it was just something, you know how sometimes you have a blind spot where you don't know how to answer something. And it was kind of
Yeah.
humorous in the moment where he was like, because when he said what the predicament was, I was just like, well, let me just tell the story. So basically he's like, yeah, I just didn't know how to answer this guy. I was like, well, what was the conversation? And he was like, you know, I was asking him if he knew anything about the Bible, you know, whatever. And he basically was like, the guy was saying, I can't remember if he said he didn't believe in the Bible or if he only read the Bible. Basically he was saying, he was like, yeah, I only read the Bible for the battle scenes or whatever, or like for the war, you know, whatever, kind of like entertainment kind of thing. And Justin was like, yeah, I just didn't know how to like respond to that. And I feel like I'm forgetting a detail, but anyways, it was something to that effect. And I think he was saying like he didn't believe in God, but he just read the Bible for like the battle stuff or whatever, something like that. And but he was saying, but he didn't believe in God. And I was like, I was like, you mean? And so I literally said it to Justin like this. I was thinking of this story and like some other like like the Walls of Jericho story, stuff like that. And
Yeah.
I was like, you mean the battle scenes that were like terrible plans, but somehow they worked? You know what I mean? Like kind of telling him like, don't you see that this only worked because of God? Like these, because the guy was saying how
Mhm.
crazy the battle scenes were, like, and I think he even mentioned Jericho. I was like, bro, none of those stories strategically make sense unless God is real. Like those victories don't happen. You walk around a wall 7 times and blow trumpets and the walls fall down. Like what kind of strategy is that? But it only works because of God. And Justin was like, man, he's like, I should have said that. And I was like, bro, I'm not trying to like shame you or anything. It's just
Yeah.
like
It's learning.
and
It's all
yeah,
learning.
yeah, and it's like it doesn't mean that guy all of a sudden believes in God if you like say that. But I
Mhm.
do think
True.
that these things that you read, you so often, you're just like, man, God is the only answer. And you see that in your own life too. Like as you start to pray, as you start to act on your faith, and it's, that's why it says like faith without deeds is dead, right? Like like test your faith, like, put it into practice. And that's when you start to see these things where you're like, wow, like that only happened because of God. And I think that's when you start having the reaction like Kyle of like, man, you're so lucky to like be persecuted, right? Kind of thing. And so, but yeah, so you kind of see that in this story, right? The guys are mocked and then they're called up, and we'll see how it ends here. And then we'll close out here soon. So I'll reread 13. Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet with his armor bearer right behind him. Then it says, the Philistines fell right behind him. Or I'm sorry. The Philistines fell before Jonathan and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. In the first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. So that's how things start. And then the next little section says Israel routs the Philistines, right? So remember at the
Mhm.
beginning of the story, we talked about how the whole army was sitting under this pomegranate tree. They're chilling. The guy with the ephod is there. Saul is there. They don't have weapons or whatever. And then these two men act. So then in verse 15 it says, then panic struck the whole army of the Philistines, those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. Saul's lookouts in Gebeth and Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, muster the forces and see who has left us. When they did, it was Jonathan and his armor bearer who were not there. So then it says Saul was talking to the priest. Da, 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 da. Then I'm going to jump down to verse 20. It says, then Saul and all his men assembled and went to battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines had gone up with them to their camp, went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So on that day, the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved beyond Beth-av. So what's crazy to me is that this story the story begins, and that's actually why I forgot. That's why I know there was a reason why beyond just telling you that there was no swords in the camp, but that was the important part. Is that at the end it was like, man, you don't even need the swords. God was going to use their own swords against them, which I was like, that's so dope. It's like you don't need swords. You don't even need weapons at all. Like I got you, kind of thing.
Mhm.
But it's just crazy how those two men and their faith like changed the fate of their whole nation, right? And that was kind of like one of the last points I made when I was preaching this sermon is that, man, like, a moment of courage, can change your whole family, can change your whole life, can change the life
Mm.
of the life of your hearers after you, which I think is
Yeah.
so cool. That's why I like that story that the Spirit put on my heart a couple episodes ago when I was telling you about all those actions that took place, like from Lori Ewing and her faith and, her being faithful through her divorce and getting remarried. And that led to, the girl Katrina being in town and me and Gio, all those things. There's stories, there's millions of stories like that, right? Where one person's faith trickled down. And I'm sure one day in heaven, like that would be something that we'll get to see, right? Like, where did my
Mm.
story come from? Like, who was it that started the domino effect that led to me loving God and giving my life to him, Was it like maybe it goes back to Jonathan and his armor bearer, right? Like that would be super cool. So I think like, we'll get to see this thread one day, of our story, and they'll all be interwoven and connected, and it's just something that, I think about, like, reading this story and so many other stories, right? But there is this moment of courage that happens, and, we can start a domino effect, or we can continue the domino effect, and I think that the sad part of that thread is you'll see when someone removes the domino and they decide, like, I'm not going to be, courageous or faithful in this moment. And that's been me. I've stopped the domino effect, I'm sure, many a times in my life, and I've continued some. And but I think that that's something, that I think about, is someone down the line made a courageous act so that, my parents were met, and then, the people that met my parents were met, people that met them were met. And so I just want to be someone that continues the domino effect. I don't want to end it.
Yeah.
It's like exciting when you like that, those crazy domino videos you see, and then if it messes up and it stops in the middle, you're like, man, that's
And
the worst.
there's only one that needs to be out of
Yeah.
alignment. Stop. Yeah.
Yep. 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 So, anyways, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Just this idea of like continuing the domino effect or just not wanting to
Mm-hmm.
in relation to like we don't want to obviously get in the way of what God has in store for us. And that means facing our fears, facing the hard things that maybe we don't want to do, but we know we should do. Right. I think with like within this story, right, like it's clear that like there was some I won't say it's easy because we always can look back to this with retrospect of like we're reading this Bible, we're reading the story 2,000 plus years later. But I do
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
like what I would make the argument that they would say it's easier for us now that we have the written word, right? And
Yeah.
we have ways that we can learn and teach and grow from these areas. There's almost no excuse for us to not be able to carry these things out or to
Mm-hmm.
be loving
Mm-hmm.
to one another or to be bold for Jesus, right? Like and figuring out what that means, right? But I guess what I'm getting at is this idea of like there'll be a million reasons for us to say it's a courageous thing just to respond to God's word. It's a courageous thing just to look at God's word and say, you know what, I want to live by it. I want
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
continue to read it. I want to know it. I want to be more curious about it. Um, yeah, and it's also and because it's a courageous to say I want to do that. It's also just hard to do that, especially in this day and age, right? Like it's just like you and I'm not saying that as a way of a cop out. I'm more so saying of like there's more reason as to why there should be more calling for us to just try to share this with people, right? Like and I don't know where I'm going with that. I'm just sitting with this idea of just like not stopping the domino effect. Like I'm thinking back to that story with Kyle and I and Josh and I at the
Mm-hmm.
Turlington Hall. You know, I'm thinking that was over 10 years ago. And yet where's my faith gone since then? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's worthy to examine of like, yeah, have I been even responding to this call myself? So I feel like this idea around just continuing to be John, I like this story because I put the focus on his armor bearer. Like Jonathan is also the hero of the story, but so is the armor bearer of like,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know what? Like have I still shown myself to be allied with my brothers and sisters in Christ to champion Jesus's work and to champion his love, right? And is that evident in my life, right? Like, is that evident in the folks I interact with? Like, do they feel like I love them as Jesus would have, right?
Mm-hmm.
And do they witness that? So and again, I think the mechanisms for how we do that, maybe that's what it is. The mechanisms for how we do that, it just looks different. You know, like many people try to do street preaching or whether it's going to a frat house or a party and talking about Jesus, right? Like there's different, I guess, like avenues for it. But all in all, like, is it done within a space that people can say, you know what? Those people are weird, but no one can deny that those people love each other and love Jesus.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
that's inspiring. That's impressive. Like, and that's different, you know. And they listen. They listen to what God is telling them, and they're trying to carry out God's work for them, even if that plan seems crazy,
Yeah.
even if
Yeah.
that plan
Yeah.
seems insane, you know. So I'm sitting with that of just like I'm really sitting with the fact like, man, it's been a while since that Turlington event. Like, how have I shown my faith to have grown since then? And that leads a little bit into my story for next week. So
Yeah.
I will save
Hey.
that as of a teaser of like I'm
Yeah.
going into.
That's what's up. Yeah, and I think a real and I don't want to leave without making this point. I think a big lesson from this story that kind of just came on my heart. Like I've thought through this thought before, but I just want to share it. Is that and it's something you said that sparked this thought was, that the like it's just as much about the armor bearer's faith too, right? Because let's like walk back through in the sense that the armor bearer didn't have a weapon, right? Like, and maybe he had one of those farm tool weapons, but he didn't have a sword. It said that Jonathan and his father Saul had swords, and that was it. So this man is also going up there without a sword. And it says, right? It says that Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet with his armor bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan and killed behind him. Basically, it was saying like the armor bearer was also killing like right behind Jonathan. Like, so I don't know what that looked like or what he was using, what he did. What I'm saying is that if sometimes you're going to be in the position of Jonathan, right, where you're the leader and you have someone that's following you, and sometimes you're going to be the armor bearer, the one following someone else. But remember that sometimes it takes more courage to be the follower than the person that's doing the leading, right? Like the person that's doing the leading has the sword, they're equipped for the moment, even though it's still a crazy moment, and what they're doing is faithful as well. But it takes courage to be the one that's less equipped but still trying to do it, right? And so when I say that is that if you're the one that's following, if you're the student, don't feel less than, like never feel less than. And if you have someone that's
Yeah.
leading you that's making you feel less than, that's not Jonathan. That's not a Jonathan, you know? Like think about it this way. The king was the one that was sitting not doing anything. The king who was the one that everyone looks to, that's why the rest of the army was sitting there not doing anything. Because the king was sitting there not doing anything. It was Jonathan that hopped up, the prince hopped up and led the army into battle, and it started with him and his armor bearer. Basically, what I'm saying is that don't always necessarily think like the minister or whatever, the one that has the title is the one I should be following all the time. Now, what I'm not saying like rebel against your leader or whatever, but what I'm saying is that there's times where if nothing's being done, like I'll talk more about my time in Orlando because that was a lot of what was going on in Orlando as I was looking to the person supposed to be leading us, and I was like, this dude ain't leading us, so let's do something. And, basically the point I'm making is that sometimes you're going to be Jonathan and sometimes you're going to be the armor bearer. And sometimes you're going to be the armor bearer and you're going to need to say, this ain't Jonathan. Like, this is not the person that needs to be leading me or who I need to follow. Let me follow, a person that I trust, that I feel comfortable saying I'm with you, heart and soul kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think that, when I think of the story, lots of times, like even Jordan and I talked about how not this passage, we're talking about Jonathan and David, but I feel like this passage has a lot of parallels, to the passage earlier in Samuel, that talks about Jonathan and David's friendship and how they loved each other as themselves, and that's a lot of this story as well. And so I think there's been times through our friendship, right, where I'm Jonathan and you're the armor bearer, and there's been times where you're Jonathan, I'm the armor bearer, and those roles switch sometimes. And so I think that that's important to find those people in your lives where, maybe you're in the position where you're Jonathan and you need to be trustworthy with that position. I mean, sometimes like you got to be humble and be an armor bearer, but the armor bearer is still doing work, They're not just sitting under the tree with the rest of the army learning, they're doing, putting in the time and the effort. And I think that that's an important distinction to make is that if you're in a position where you're learning and you're trying to figure things out, that doesn't mean you're less than. And no one that is truly a Jonathan-like figure should make you feel less than. So yeah, I just thought that point needed to be said. So, but yeah, I hope that this story has, sparked something in your heart, whoever is listening. And I know that, this story inspires me so much. Like every time I think about it, every time I read it, it kind of inspires me to want to keep diving into the scriptures, to look for someone to meet, to, step out on faith in some situation in my life. And so I know that's what it's kind of sparking in my mind and my heart right now. But I'm looking forward to Jordan's story next week, and it will be a surprise. I don't know what it is yet, and you don't either. So we'll find out together next week. But I love this type of a conversation. I hope that we do more of them. I'm already thinking of, doing these episodes here and there where we walk through a story in the passage, and maybe we call it Strolling Through the Scriptures or something like that. So hopefully you enjoyed scrolling through the scriptures with us, and we will see you next week with Jordan's story. We love you guys. Please like, comment, subscribe. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, rate and leave a comment. Leave a rating for us. That would help us out a bunch. Subscribe to the YouTube. That would be great as well. We're going to have these episodes out every Monday. And we're going to be dropping some other stuff, some football content that will come out on Fridays or Wednesdays or some other days of the week. And we're thinking of some new things that we want to do that will be outside of the episodes that come out on Monday. So please follow us in our journey. We love you guys, and we will see you next week. We're signing off.
Yeah.